Hello, everybody, and welcome to our seventh night, which is Meaning and Purpose. We have a wonderful speaker with us tonight. Jill Farabelli is a licensed clinical social worker and a certified palliative care social worker. She practices as a palliative care social worker at the Abramson Cancer Center at the University of Pennsylvania Health System. Her focus is on the whole person and family, addressing each person's social and emotional well-being through counseling, care, planning, and helping to navigate the healthcare system. She also has a small private practice, and Jill has earned her master's degree from San Diego State University and has completed a Zelda Foster Fellowship in Palliative Care through NYU Silver School of Social Work. So I am thrilled to turn it over to you, Jill.
Thank you so much, Jen. That's a lot of background that probably is really irrelevant for anything that we're going to be talking about tonight, but I am so honored to be here with all of you. I am just going to pop up my screen, my slides really quickly here. So give me a second to get myself together. Okay. All right, it's not pulling it up the way I want it to. So one second, sorry here. We did actually, can you all see? What do you see?
We do see your notes in the next slides, so
Okay.
you can put
We
it in.
did practice this, you guys.
And you did perfectly. Just if you look for that display button. Down on the bottom right hand side, there's like next to the sliding bar, there's yeah, there you go. Boop,
Okay,
you're good.
perfect. I have a new version of the Zoom, so it's throwing me off a little bit here. Well, thank you everyone for being here. I know it was such a beautiful day, and it was probably difficult to come back if you were able to spend some time outside or whatnot. So I don't know. I'm hoping that tonight we can be a little bit interactive, and I know that there's not always comfort level with speaking as we're being recorded, and that's okay. So Jen offered to stop recording so that you all can unmute. If you also feel more comfortable popping in the chat, that's okay. I may not be able to entirely see the chat, so Jen, I need your help monitoring some of that. So like Jen mentioned, my name's Jill. From all of that, all you really need to know is that I am a licensed clinical social worker and a therapist. I work at University of Penn, and I work in palliative and supportive oncology clinics, so mostly outpatient, but I have done some time on the inpatient team for the last 10 years. So I've been doing medical social work and since I graduated college, so it's been over 20 years, and it's really been what I've been drawn to since I went to school. And mostly it's what, the relationships that I get to develop with people. So people like you all are why I do this and why I show up for work. So thank you for being who you all are. So Jen had asked me to come share a little bit with you all about meaning-centered psychotherapy. So there may be some bigger terms that I'm going to try to keep it as simple and practical as possible. Does anyone know anything about meaning-centered psychotherapy? I know this theme for your week is meaning and purpose. Okay. Well, good. So it'll all be fresh and new, and I won't be repeating myself, which is so. Meaning-centered psychotherapy is a very structured type of therapy that was developed specifically to address the loss of spiritual well-being or sense of meaning in life, and existential distress that really often arises in patients or in people that have cancer. And so, like I mentioned, I really would like this to be as interactive as possible. I prefer not to hear myself talking for long periods of time. So there might be a few times where I ask for engagement. But I really just appreciate, anyone that wants to kind of jump in. One thing that I will ask before we really dive in here is if you don't mind just grabbing a piece of paper and a pencil or having your phone handy, there is a point where I'm going to ask you to think about a question or two and jot some stuff down. So it might be helpful to have that handy. I thought it might be helpful to start with a quote here for this evening, and I'll go ahead and read it. I think it really captures, and this is really like the essence of this type of therapy. It was a lot longer, so I shortened it. So you'll see a couple dots in there where I took some sections out. Nothing, it was a lot of, it didn't lose the essence of what it was trying to say. So, life holds meaning for each and every individual, and even more, it retains this meaning literally to the last breath. And the therapist can show his patient that life never ceases to have a meaning. To be sure, he cannot show his patient what the meaning is, but he may well show him that there is meaning and that life retains it, and that it remains meaningful under any conditions, even the tragic and negative aspects of life, such as unavoidable suffering, can be turned into human achievement by which a man adopts his predicament, transforming despair into triumph. So this was a quote by Viktor Frankl, and we're going to learn a little bit more about him through the course of the night. Show of hands, anyone know who Viktor Frankl is? Okay, a couple people recognize the name. Okay, we'll come back to him, so stay tuned. What I thought might be helpful is to lay a little bit of the groundwork, like the foundation about talking about meaning, and then we'll dive into what the actual therapy looks like, because if you're interested, there is some resources out there that you may be able to go through it yourself. So a lot of what I present here tonight is going to be included in the first session without actually leading you through a whole therapy session. But I may ask you bits and pieces of it as we move on. So the next slide is going to kind of maybe jog your brain a little bit here. So have any of you had any of these thoughts, questions, ponderings at any point ever in your life?
Sure.
Why? Who am I? What's the meaning of all of this? I see some heads shaking. I think for a lot of us, it encompasses a lot of what we think about, right? So terms like meaning and purpose, though, can feel or be pretty vague. And so today, we are going to explore the meaning through the lens of this particular therapeutic intervention. And also, hopefully, it might give you something to consider for how you might experience meaning in your own life. So this may be a point where we can mute it or stop recording it. Before we get started, is anyone willing to share, whether in the chat or unmuting themselves, what do you think of when you think of meaning and purpose? Like, what does it mean to you? I definitely heard some threads and some themes, but we all have our own particular way of describing it. So thank you for being willing to share. There's some basic concepts of meaning that are helpful through the meaning-centered psychotherapy. So this is type of therapy, like I mentioned already, is based in part on Viktor Frankl's work. So I saw a couple people raise their hand. So he was an Austrian psychiatrist, for those of you that don't know, and also a Holocaust survivor. And he founded a type of therapy called logotherapy, which was basically a school of thought that describes a search for a life's meaning, but that being the central kind of human motivation. That's the thing that kind of pulls us forward, is for us as humans to figure out what life is and what meaning is. He actually even wrote a book called A Man's Search for Meaning, which is a really complementary piece of the therapy. It's not required reading. However, a lot of patients going through the therapy find it really helpful. And so this was all really inspired by his work. In his work, as you can see here on this slide, there's 3 really main themes that are utilized in meaning-centered psychotherapy. He really thought his work was focused around meaning as motivation. And so I thought it would be helpful to kind of dive into the pillars from his framework to talk a little bit more about. And the first one is this idea that the will to meaning. And so what he says is that the need to find our meaning is basically why we exist. Like, it's our motivating force. Meaning making is a defining characteristic of us as human beings, different than any of the other species here. The second one is that life has meaning. So this basic concept often evokes something in people, whether it's curiosity, maybe contemplation, hope, whatever it is. So I encourage you, and you don't have to share out loud or even in the chat, but just sit with this for a minute or so. And as I continue to talk, this is the framework from which will come. Frankl really believed that life has meaning. It never ceases to have meaning, or the potential for meaning, from our first moments of life up until our last. So though what we do find meaningful may change over time, especially as people's circumstances change, that can really change. So in meaning-centered psychotherapy, the concept was adapted, and maybe even more simply put, the possibility to create or experience meaning does exist in our lives, even in the last weeks, the last months, days, or hours. If we feel that life is meaningless, it's not because there is no meaning in our lives, or as he said, like the possibility of creating it. It's because we've become disconnected from it. Maybe become so demoralized because of our circumstances that we don't see any possibility of creating or experiencing meaning. The idea then becomes to search, right? We constantly are searching for this meaning. Why am I here? What is this all about? What's the purpose of this? It's in this search, actually, that it can be even more important and then actually arriving at a meaningful destination. I'm sure you've all heard, right? Like, the journey is better, or it's not about the destination, it's about the journey. So it's this same sort of concept. There's been lots of other existential philosophers who I will not name, and we don't, this is, not a philosophy lesson by any means, but who felt that there's no externally given meaning to our human existence, that it's really left up to us to create it. And like Frankl, also held out the possibility that it is our responsibility as humans to create it. So whether, it's you believe that there's a creator and that he gave us that, or if it's something that is kind of innate humanistic, to search for this meaning in our life. The last thing on here, the last pillar, is the freedom of will. So this one is really interesting. And even as I was going through this training myself, all of these concepts I kind of had to sit with and think about, because I didn't necessarily think of them in these ways. But the freedom of will really meaning that in our existence, we can even choose our attitude towards suffering. So while there's many aspects of suffering that we have zero control over, Frankl really suggested that perhaps the last vestige of our human freedom is the ability to consider and choose our attitude over that suffering, even when almost everything else has been taken to us. So he himself came to this realization when he was in a concentration camp. So certainly cancer, illness, and treatment are not to be compared to the same concentration camp experience. However, cancer, illness, treatment does in fact create limitations, creates suffering, creates giving up all of that control that we thought that we had. So the belief that despite all of these things, we can have the freedom to choose and the attitude to choose, especially in the cancer experience. This is a heavy piece of the work, right? And trying to really kind of digest this. So if anyone has any questions or thoughts and wants to put them in the chat, be happy to kind of come back to that. So we're going to step away from this part a little bit now that I've maybe given you lots to think about and blew your brains a little bit here in terms of all the information. Let's move into what actually is the, whoops, I skipped a slide. The general overview of the psychotherapy. So let's give our brains a break a little bit here. Like I mentioned, this was developed by a research group at Memorial Sloan Kettering in New York. The group there, I think it's been about 20 years, give or take. The group really wanted to understand the clinical and also the spiritual existential importance of meaning and preserving meaning as a concept, especially as patients were going through cancer and cancer treatment. So this intervention was designed for individuals with a cancer diagnosis. It's designed to really help diminish fears of feelings of despair that can be associated, and hopefully by attempting to help patients really focus on the importance of creating, reconnecting, experiencing, sustaining meaning in the face of illness. By now, you probably are hearing me. These concepts are talked about over and over, and even as you go through the therapy, everything that's talked about, all of the themes, everything comes back to this meaning. So has anyone gone through the training? Sorry if I asked this. No one has. Okay. If so, I would be interested to hear what your experience is. So there's definitions of meaning, and the definitions that we see here on the slide are the definitions that the study uses. And so it comes back to these definitions. When someone is facing cancer, that experience of distress or despair can offer an opportunity for growth and meaning. So one may often have a sense of loss of that meaning and purpose in their life. And others may have a sustaining their meaning or even a heightened sense of meaning and purpose as they go through it. So really drawing from these principles, meaning-centered psychotherapy helps to enhance patients' sense of meaning by connecting to various sources of meaning in their life. So we'll talk about what those sources of meaning are. Sometimes people reframe their suffering, assuming they don't really have control to maybe remove the source of that suffering, and even the opportunity to explore what it might serve in their life. This highlights Viktor Frankl's, his central premise really was around the ability to turn a tragedy into triumph. And that is by the way that we choose to find meaning in our suffering. So when I first heard this, it took me a bit to kind of understand what he was saying here. And I think suffering is not necessarily, we don't have to have suffering to find meaning, but it can be a possible avenue for it. So meaningfulness is maybe not something that we can take or be taken for granted for, but something that we can actually create. So one of the things that is really important is, as whether it's the therapist, we're not trying to put a positive spin on having cancer or having some sort of chronic or serious illness diagnosis, but really kind of focusing and exploring what is the possibility here? What is the individual's meaning of, what's their perspective on meaning? What does it mean to them? So kind of reconnecting already to what is established in their life, not necessarily to find meaning through the illness. Does that make sense to everyone? Or does that feel a little bit confusing? Okay. So what does it actually look like? So it mimics your group here a little bit, but I think you have 8 sessions, right? They're 8 weeks. It is 7 sessions. So the goal of these sessions is to help patients really target what's meaningful in their lives, offer different ways of maintaining a sense of meaning, purpose, value. I remember someone mentioned value while they're living through their cancer experiences. So these sessions are more structured. They're not really open-ended. Each session has a specific topic and a goal. The idea also is that the participant holds some responsibility to use these sessions for themselves to discover these sources of meanings. And we'll talk more about those sources on the next slide. This type of therapy uses a combination of things to kind of promote this discovery, this exploration. Didactic teaching, so similar to what I'm doing now, kind of like a lecture style. The therapist provides some context and food for thought around meaning making as humans. And then there is a homework piece of this therapy that is actually really important. I bet you all thought you gave up homework many years ago, right? But the homework piece of it is important because it allows time during the session to really open up and dive into some of the things that you bring to the session as the participant. So that part really is to enhance the learning, incorporate different pieces of meaning into your life. And then there's just an open-ended discussion where the therapist and the patient kind of talk. The idea is that this really, the hope is to support someone's spiritual well-being, enhance their quality of life, and reduce anxiety. And so when they were doing this intervention, they had a study group, and so had different participants. And that's kind of what they found, that reduced depression, reduced anxiety, enhanced people's quality of life. So it's continued, and it's been really broad, and now it's offered in many different places. So you've heard me mention sources of meaning a couple times now. So some of Frankl's work is that we utilize in this therapy specifically, is that meaning in human existence has really basic, universal, really accessible sources. So in its most elementary form, meaning in life is derived from dedicating yourself to someone or something. I think someone even had a pretty close definition to that earlier. So maybe it's through loving someone, caring about something in the world. So we explored the broader definition of meaning, but we're going to take it a little bit of a step further here for this type of therapy and expand it into these sources of meaning. So as you can see, there's 4 different sources here in each of the columns. I did my best to pick a picture that represented what the theme was here. The first one is historical sources of meaning, meaning meaning that our meaning occurs in a historical context. So it involves our legacy, the legacy that was given to us, the things that we, inherited from our past, from our parents, from our ancestors, the legacy that we're currently living, the present, and then the legacy that we leave for the future. So some of the themes in this session are talking about transcending past legacy of hardship and loss, really embracing values of our past, present, and future. Attitudinal sources of meaning is the one that refers to the attitude that we take towards encountering life's limitations. How do we look at pain? How do we look at suffering? How do we look at adversity? So Frankel really highlighted the process of choosing our attitude towards suffering or limitations. Like I mentioned, that human tragedy into a personal triumph. So our attitude. And some of the themes in this session are really around identifying our conscious choices, highlighting our personal resiliency, and then our attitude and how we cope with illness. Creative sources, I think this might be one of the funner sessions. It really includes meaning through work, artistic pursuits, different causes, things that we're deriving in our life that were from a process of our creation. So how we feel like we're living up to our full unique potential, and then how we actively engage in life. Themes here are courage, maybe commitments that we have, maybe even attending to unfinished business. And the final one is experiential sources of meaning. So this is really how we connect to life. This is probably the source of meaning that we don't have to think about so much, and it just kind of comes naturally to us. How we're in relationships, maybe even to ourselves, maybe to our loved ones, beauty, nature, laughing, humor. It's that connection and connectedness, which is really essential to our survival as human beings and as a human experience. So these are the sources of meaning. Maybe it's the senses, all the beauty, all those things that we kind of see around us. So understandably, these may seem, when you think about them, fairly obvious or maybe somewhat abstract. And a lot of times in the weeks of the therapy, there's a lot of overlap. But through the course of the therapy, we're constantly kind of coming back and even naming which source of meaning do we feel like this kind of falls under. What we do know, and what we've even heard from the definitions earlier tonight, is that what is thought to be meaningful is really unique, right? It's specific to each of us. It can speak to what we feel as an individual of what's important. Maybe it's our belief system, our internal values, maybe even what we hope for the future. Meaning can be spontaneous, and it really kind of appears on its own. And so a lot of times a sense of meaning, we maybe shouldn't expect it to appear on its own, but to look for it and take some responsibility for finding it in those tasks, those moments, those activities that we really find irreplaceable in our day-to-day. And then even in those moments, maybe ask what life requires of us. And that's where we can find some of that meaning and purpose. So like I mentioned, there's 7 different topics and themes. So the type of conversation in each one, like I said, there's overlap, and sometimes the homework's given at the end of the session for next week, or sometimes it's done together. So session 1, and we really are not seeking to prescribe meaning for you. So it's helping the individual, like I mentioned, really come to a sense of knowing and being in their own. So session 1 focuses on the concepts and sources of meaning. So a lot of what we've talked about here tonight is brought up in that. It's really general. It's how it can relate to your life, globally, or even how it relates specifically to cancer diagnosis. Session 2 centers on the cancer and the meaning. So focusing on a patient's sense of identity before and after their diagnosis. Session 3 is that historical. Session 4, attitudinal. 5 is creative sources of meaning. 6 is experiential, and 7, then we talk about how to transition. So really giving an opportunity to reflect upon their experience through this therapy, and then also to talk about hopes for the future. A lot of the ways that we find meaning are through our experience. So even though that is the highlight of session 6, it's really, I would say, kind of strewn throughout all of the sessions together. So this is where I'm going to ask you all to take out your pen and paper or your notes on your phone, and even if anyone might be willing to share at some point. So in session 1, usually participants don't come, sorry, I'm skipping ahead here. Usually participants don't come prepared. There is a handbook that's given to participants beforehand so that they kind of can go through and they can see it. But I'm wondering if you wouldn't mind, and I felt like this was probably an easier one for us to go through and do together. Listing 1 or 2 experiences where life has felt particularly meaningful to you, whether it sounds something powerful or mundane. It can be something that helped you get through a difficult time. Maybe when you felt most alive. I'll stop talking for a second and let you guys jot stuff down.
Do you want me to pause?
In a minute, yeah. Yeah, go ahead, Jen, that way. Sorry. So on the upcoming slides, it goes through each session and what the theme is, and then the different homework. As you can see, there's a lot on there. So I don't think we need to kind of read all of these things, but you can see each of the sessions really focuses on these specific themes and concepts, and the questions that are answered relate back to it. And then the final question in the session 7, when we talk about transition, is really like, what are your hopes for the future? And it all kind of ties back into the things that you've learned over the last 7 weeks, that you've learned about yourself and that you've offered as a participant, and kind of tying it all together. One thing that will say, so there's 7 sessions, and I think ideally what the intervention is trying to put that into a 12-week period, so that, there's some flexibility. It doesn't have to be every week. For some people, it's twice a week. It just all kind of depends, but trying to not extend it so long that the meat and the momentum of the conversations go a little bit maybe dry, or you kind of forget things. And so because we're building on in each session, it's helpful to do them as closely as possible together. So I think, am I about on time? Maybe, or close to it. Any questions?
Do you want me to stop recording?
Yeah, I guess so.